One or two drones straying into Polish territory is potentially an accident, as the president said. 19 is not. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, Bulwark contributor, and I'm joined by my colleague in all things strategery reporting in from Israel, Eliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, contributing writer to The Atlantic, and part-time instructor at Shalem College in Israel. Eliot, welcome back to Shield of the Republic.
Well, it's good to be back. I'll the next time you see me, I'll be reporting from my home base in the Washington area. This has been a very hard week in many ways. In the United States, in Israel as well, where there was a terrorist attack, which I don't think was particularly well reported in the American press, at just a bus stop, and 6 older people killed, another half dozen seriously wounded. The good news is it's a beautiful place. There are a lot of wonderful people. It's a place under enormous amount of strain, but there are a lot of things to see and do, including climbing a Crusader castle in the Galilee called Montfort, which was the home of the Order of Teutonic Knights, which is really something to wrap your head around. But as so often the case, I digress.
And I've been there and done that. And I recall from an earlier part of my political career, having read Professor Joshua Prower's work on Crusaders in Israel and their fortifications, and striking how much the overlay of Crusader fortifications also tends to map to Israeli settlement activity.
Yeah, well, there are all kinds of things. It's another rabbit hole to go down to. I guess obviously the biggest news, which is not really foreign affairs news entirely, although there's an external dimension, was the murder of Charlie Kirk this week in the United States. This is not something we would normally. Well, we don't usually talk simply about domestic politics. We're focused on foreign affairs and national security, but I think we should note it. It goes without saying that it's just evil, full stop. You don't say yes, but you don't say, well, on the other hand. It's just evil and worthy of condemnation. It's interesting to see it from here, where, on the one hand, you have a sense that there's really sort of a looming cloud, which to talk about. You may want to discuss a bit what the Trump administration may or may not get up to. I will say I was somewhat reassured by the reaction of the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, who I thought spoke really well. I thought Bernie Sanders actually gave a very forceful denunciation of this. Gavin Newsom, who's not my favorite Democratic politician, spoke very well. There were other Republicans, James Langford, I think you had mentioned, who spoke up and saying exactly the right things, exactly the things you want politicians to say at the moment. Our president, of course, is not one of them. So that gives me some hope, but it's a pretty dark moment.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, both you and I are old enough to remember quite acutely the paroxysm of violence, political violence that the U.S. went through for about a decade between 1963 and 1974. A number of assassinations of political figures, including President John F. Kennedy, his brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, of course, attempted assassinations of President Gerald Ford. And that, paroxysm of violence was a terrible time for the country. And I fear we're in one of those terrible times now. The difference between then and now, in my book, is the totally pernicious influence of social media, and it's made it infinitely worse than it already was in those days. And I think there's a very big danger that a lot of people are going to see this assassination as a validation of all their prior beliefs, whether about violence emanating from the left or the right. And as you just said, the important point is that from whence ever the violence comes, it's an assault on liberal democracy, which is, by the way, a topic that we do address on this show, which is the fate of liberal democracy here at home and abroad. I might add that I've been watching the assault on liberal democracy in Turkey that's going on as we speak, and is very, very close to extirpating two-party democracy in Turkey for the first time since 1950. And that is a terrible thing in and of itself. I do worry about the uses to which the Trump administration may put some of this. I thought Juliet Kayyem put it very well. Everybody's looking to see what ideology the shooter had. And even Governor Cox has described this as a, quote, leftist ideology. I don't know that we know enough yet about the motives of the shooter to even be able to say that. What we can say, I think, from the facts that have emerged so far, is that this person was almost terminally online, very involved in the gaming subculture, as Governor Cox put it, the dark corners of the internet. And more often than not, a lot of these political assassins have, not a really discernible left or right ideology. It's a mix of their own mental illness and, stray political thoughts justifying violence on the internet, whether from the left or the right. Although I do think we have to bear in mind the statistical reality that when you look at the charts of, from the FBI and other law enforcement sources of political violence in the U.S., it's overwhelmingly from the right. That's not to excuse political violence that emanates from the left, like the shooting of Congressman Representative Steve Scalise. But I think it's important to keep in mind, that there's a balance that has to be maintained politically. And trying to use this to go after your political enemies, as Stephen Miller and the Trump administration said, is a very, very dangerous moment for the country.
I agree with that. Just on the social media part, and there really are two aspects to it. One is, for somebody who is, I would say even for people who are not mentally unstable, the way in which the internet allows you to kind of go deep into dark places. I know people who are extremely well educated, who, begin obsessively following different parts of the internet and, begin believing all kinds of crazy things. So it's a good way to radicalize people who, for whatever reason, are susceptible to that. I mean, I sometimes think it's almost like alcoholism, where, there are just some people who cannot simply take one drink and leave it at that. So that's one thing. But then the second thing is, what social media gives you is communities of hate, not discussion, not debate, nothing remotely like that. And so it's really doubly pernicious. I think as a society, and this may be something we want to talk about with some of our future guests, people are beginning to wrestle with this. So I think there's a much stronger awareness among parents that you need to control social media use by kids. But it really is clearly pernicious. We'll see too what the legacy of Charlie Kirk is. Neither you nor I would be likely to follow him for any reason, just because he's speaking to a very different demographic. I will say, as I've learned more about it afterwards, even though some of his views, I'm sure I know would find reprehensible, he was trying to engage. He was engaging people who vehemently disagreed with him, and going to speak with them peacefully in places where he knew he would not be welcome. And I think it would be a good thing if everybody would emphasize that that part of what he did. We'll see what he turns into, or what he turns into as kind of an icon of the new American right. I think we don't know. And the last thing I'll say is, this is kind of it's a dark thought, I suppose, but it's a darkly optimistic one. As you said, you and I remember a pretty terrible time in which not only you had that political violence, including assassination and assassination attempts, you had otherwise reasonable people advocating lunatic things, including riot and violence. I vividly remember there was a very well-known Harvard philosophy professor, Hillary Putnam, who advocated burning down Harvard's great Widener Library, and you were on the campus at Cornell then, and so you remember those things. So we have passed through periods of insanity like this before, but it's a bit sobering to remember that that lasted, as you said, at least a decade, in some ways a bit more.
Yeah, I think we should probably move on at this point. But as you say, this the assault on liberal democracy, and the role of violent rhetoric and is a subject which we are going to return to probably sometime in mid-October with a future guest. While you were in Israel, Frank Miller and I were busy writing last week about the large-scale incursion of Russian drones into Poland. We did it in the pages of the Dispatch because one of the editors there reached out to us and said, "This seems like a kind of big deal to me. It's kind of getting lost in all this Charlie Kirk news. Maybe we should, comment on it." And Frank and I did. And it was followed, of course, by penetrations of Romanian airspace. And what Frank and I wrote was actually taking a leaf from, what Donald Rumsfeld once said, weakness is provocative. And what we've seen from Trump vis-a-vis Putin, both before and since the summit in Alaska, has been a postponement of action, and looking, in my view, for pretexts for an action. For instance, Trump's somewhat unhinged Truth Social post in which he said, "This is Zelensky and Biden's war," as if Putin had not invaded Ukraine twice, and that we'll put sanctions on if the Europeans put 100% tariffs on India and China for Russian oil, as if that is the only way to choke off the Russian economy. That this is really a pretext for inaction. It's not a call to action. And Putin knows it. And Putin, since his meeting with Trump, has been wagering he can win this on the battlefield. The pattern of attacks, the aerial assault on Ukraine from drones and missiles has intensified enormously since the summit. One or two drones straying into Polish territory is potentially an accident, as the president said. 19 is not, as Prime Minister Tusk and as EU Foreign Minister Kaja Kallas have said. This clearly seems to be a calculated probe. As Ben Hodges, our former chief of U.S. Army Europe, said, this is a probe of NATO's air defenses. NATO, I think, actually, although there's been a lot of hand-wringing, including from some of our friends about NATO's failure here, NATO actually, I think, shot down something like 15 of 19 of these things with Dutch F-35s, Polish F-16s. They had Italian AWACS up. They met at Poland's request at the North Atlantic Council, invoking Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which allows countries that have been attacked to call for, collective discussion of the threat. NATO's talking about a program we don't exactly know what it is, Eastern Sentry, that's going to step up its counter-drone capabilities in the frontline states. So that's all, to the good. but it really needs to be a transatlantic kind of effort here with the U.S. in the lead. And there is a lot of, I mean, I think, number one, there ought to be a message to Belarus, which was the source of a number of these drones, and with whom Russia has just launched the largest military exercise, Zapad 2025, since 2021. There ought to be a message to Belarus that if this happens again, there's going to be military action against the sources of those drone attacks by NATO. And I think the economy, though, is clearly, his Achilles heel. And there are ways to attack it that don't involve the tariffs that Trump has proposed. You could join the Europeans in lowering the oil and price cap, which has been a very effective tool against Russian oil revenues. You could seize the $300 billion in frozen assets and provide them to the Ukrainians to purchase defense goods, both from Europe and the United States. You could add to the designations of the ghost fleet that the Biden administration did at the end of its term, and which the EU has extended and the US has not yet extended, to make it harder for Russia to actually carry out the oil trade and diminish their revenues. There are lots of things that can be done and should be done, but aren't being done by the Trump administration.
Yeah, so I agree with all that. On Trump, I think there are a number of reasons why he's not doing very much, but I think he's personally disheartened because I think he really did believe that he could fix this one in a few days or maybe a few weeks. And of course, it's turned out that that's completely a pipe dream. He can't admit to himself that he totally misread Putin. He is wary of a large-scale confrontation for whatever reason. I would note that, while what he said was ridiculous, the fact is that, our sales of military hardware to Ukraine continue. Sort of, the kind of quiet collaboration on intelligence and stuff continues. So there's a lot of now that may be bureaucratic inertia, but I don't think it's just that. I mean, I think Trump is perfectly willing to let that go on. He's not willing to spend money, but he's willing to let it go on. The more troubling, that's troubling, because I completely agree. We should be doing all those things and more. The question of why the Russians are doing this, I think, bears some reflection. So what they did was they fired a bunch of unarmed drones at Poland, I think very deliberately, so that they weren't actually going to kill people, although something falling out of the air can, if it lands on you, can kill you. I think it probably had several purposes. One is simply to attempt to intimidate the Poles, which is a bad idea. Poles being Poles, but we have to remember that Putin is not a guy who necessarily perceives the outside world correctly. And so I think and same thing with Romania. It's an attempt at intimidation. It's kind of a classic sort of salami tactic. Well, if we can get away with this, maybe the next thing you can do is something a little bit more violent to Estonia, for example. Entirely conceivable to me that will come. I think the main, one of the things that's very dangerous about the situation is I think Putin thinks he's winning. I think he thinks he's taken the measure of Trump. Trump's not going to get in the way of anything. He's clearly getting serious Chinese support. They are able to mass produce large numbers of drones,
and North Korean, not just Chinese.
Right. So I think he has that kind of. He thinks he has that kind of support. I don't know if he is being told about the damage that's being done to the oil industry and to economic infrastructure by the Ukrainian strikes, which are continuing and are apparently having quite considerable success. So I think he thinks he's on a roll, and it's very dangerous because he's, on the one hand, he's a criminal and a thug. I think on the other hand, as with many aging dictators, there's kind of a messianic element to it as well, where he's going to be the guy to restore the Russian Empire. So I think what this boils down to is you could get into a very, very dangerous situation. My response on something like this, I mean, I would have been in favor of taking all of the sovereign wealth funds a long time ago, but I think it needs to be more overtly military. So, what you just said about going after that, Belarus should know that it's in the crosshairs. I think being willing to intercept drones over Ukrainian airspace in coordination with the Ukrainians, I think that would be a perfectly reasonable thing. So, in other words, make the Russians realize that by doing this kind of thing, they are increasing the likelihood of European states getting directly involved in the defense of Ukraine. That I think would trouble them quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I do think part of, this was a probe, and as you just said, salami slicing tactics. It's also a kind of classic Soviet/Russian wedge driving. And Putin, for a long time, has wanted to, test the Article 5 guarantee and try and make the Europeans believe that the U.S. is not going to ride, to the rescue of Europe if it gets into a dust up with him, that they'll be left to their own devices against, what he sees as a increasingly powerful Russia, even if they see it as a country that's, got a middle-sized European economy and, a military that hasn't actually really distinguished itself, on the battlefield in Ukraine very much, but still, a threat and a worry for them. So it is very dangerous because he might, miscalculate and, create a terrible situation where the U.S. will have to honor its Article 5 guarantee, and God knows where it goes from there. I would say the other thing about the Trump administration approach to this, which seems really wrongheaded, is that they've been engaging with Belarus. They had a senior White House official meeting with Lukashenko. Now, that was justified on the grounds of, winning the release of some political prisoners, which they did, which is, of course, laudable. But they've now sent a couple of observers to Belarus to watch the Zapad 2025 exercise. And there are two things here that I would note about this. One is that the Belarusian military, in the run-up to this exercise that kicked off last Friday, had said that part of the exercise was going to be to showcase the potential use of nuclear weapons situated on Belarusian territory and by Russia. They have pulled back from that a little bit, at least in terms of what they're declaring. We'll see how the whole exercise plays out, of course. But that in and of itself suggests that maybe the response that they got from NATO was enough to suggest maybe we ought to pull back a little bit. That's a good thing. The effort to engage, I mean, Reuters was reporting that this, outreach to Belarus appears to be a calculated Trump policy. I don't know whether that's the case or not. If it is, it seems to me to be very wrong-headed. It seems to be based on the notion, again, based on Reuters reporting, that Lukashenko talks to Putin a lot. Therefore, he might have influence on Putin. Therefore, we should cultivate him so he can, get Putin to stop this war, which is a crazy misreading of the power dynamic between Lukashenko and Putin, and the way in which influence flows in that relationship.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, would it, where they've, just made truly ludicrous assumptions about foreign policy and about what's possible. And this, it's more Witkoffery, I suppose. So we keep on coining these terms. No, I think, I mean, it is a ludicrous thing. Part of what makes the situation dangerous, I think, is I suspect that Putin thinks he has a much stronger hand that he does. I think he suspects that he has a better military than he does. The Russians are pretty clearly sort of trying to mass forces for one last big push to take the Donbass. Who knows? I mean, the Ukrainians are clearly very thinly stretched, where they'll be able to pull it off. But there's I wouldn't be surprised if Putin believes all the cliches about a battle-hardened military. I don't know if you remember the run-up to the first Gulf War, everybody was talking about the battle-hardened Iraqi military going up against these sort of fresh-faced Americans who had not fought a war in 30 years, and quite the reverse was true. They got creamed, and I think the same thing would actually happen to the Russians as well. That if you took a bunch of exhausted Russian divisions and you threw them against Poland and the Baltic states and Finland, supported by Allied air power, it really wouldn't work out well for them in a conflict where it's not like having a static line where you're flying lots of drones all over the place, but a mobile battlefield, and one in which airspace is really contested. I think it would look very, very different. But I doubt that he knows that, and I doubt even more that his generals would tell him that.
Yeah, we need to move on to another subject, but I would just note that a lot of Putin's henchmen, his factotum, have been making very threatening noises about Finland and how they're going to destroy Finnish statehood and whatnot. And speaking as a former U.S. ambassador to Finland who has some sense of the Finnish military, which is quite good, and its capacity to mobilize a very large military force. I mean, there's a part of me that, well, I don't want to do this on behalf of the Finns, but kind of bring it on. I mean, it's just, I think it would go very badly for the Russians. So Israel launched a military strike on Doha in Qatar this week to try and kill senior Hamas leaders, which at one level is sort of understandable. But I'm curious for you to report back to us how this looks inside Israel, because I'm reading stuff about the intelligence community and the IDF senior leadership having been in virtual open rebellion against the prime minister about this strike and not wanting to go ahead with it. What can you tell us?
So, I mean, I think the first thing to say is it's quite amazing playing out in the Israeli news reports and newspapers and television is the fact that it's very clear that the chief of staff who Netanyahu appointed, El Zamir, was not in favor of the Gaza City operation and is not in favor, was definitely not in favor of the Doha operation. Apparently there was a kind of a Mossad option, and Mossad said, no, we don't want to do it. So they didn't do it. It was, as is always the case with the Israelis, kind of technically exquisite, although it didn't get, these things are always dicey, but they was, I guess, firing a ballistic missile off an airplane. So technically the missile's flying over Saudi airspace. So there are a number of possible explanations for it. I mean, in general, I should say in the background, everybody hates Bibi. They really hate him. I think people do not think that he has the country's best interests at heart in Gaza, but instead has his own government and his own personal kind of political survival first and foremost. And he's in the grip of a coalition where he's boxed in by the ultra-right, who are a dangerous bunch, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, and by the ultra-Orthodox, who are desperately keen to avoid conscription. And as in other recent visits, I have to say that the fury against the ultra-Orthodox for not going to serve is considerable. On the Doha operation itself, I think there are several possible explanations. One, which may be the simplest, is if you have an exquisite hammer, then every problem does look like a nail, and the exquisite hammer is the Israeli Air Force. Second thing, the Israelis are genuinely committed to killing every last leader of Hamas, and I don't blame them. But I think, one argument is, well, if you take out these guys, then you have a more, that actually opens the way to negotiations. I think more plausible argument is they're actually just as happy to kill the negotiations. I think, as is often the case, the Israelis frequently get kind of tunnel vision, and I think that's what happened. That's part of what happened here. I mean, they didn't seem to think, the United States has considerable equities in Qatar, which is a loathsome place. I mean, I'll just stipulate that. It does also have this, gigantic airbase of ours in the shape of Al Hadid, which both you and I have flown in and out of. And, just like they don't, this government doesn't care about it. I think the main thing the main point I want to make here is popular opinion was not in favor of this. This was the Israeli government. This is, it's not what the military wanted to do, not what the intelligence community wanted to do. And it's everybody I've spoken to seems to be totally convinced that, when they have the next election, which I think is next October, that Bibi is gone, that he has no credibility left. As long as I'm reporting on things here, so I have been teaching. They're Israeli undergraduates, but Israelis do their military service after high school. Men for a minimum of 3 years, I think women 2 years. But actually, it's usually a lot longer than that, because if you want to be an officer, you sign up for an additional year. And a lot of kids are recruited into further military service. So, I have undergraduates who, spent 6 years on active duty. Almost all of them are continuing to do reserve duty, including the women. And so almost every student that I've had has come up to me and said, Professor Cohen, and they're very good students. I mean, I really enjoy them. Professor Cohen, I'm terribly sorry. My unit's been called up. Some of the kids, 500 days of active duty since the war began. And they are, I would say, tired and distracted. They are, the one thing that I think is important to remember is there's no question in any Israeli's mind that Hamas is just a monstrously evil organization that's out to annihilate them. And so at some level, the motivation to fight them is there. And despite everything, Israeli society does rally around its military, and the people in the military are just it's a people's army, so it's very tightly integrated, and I think it shields them from a lot of the sort of post-traumatic stress kinds of things that you have, that we experience. Although you have that too, you do have post-traumatic stress. Interestingly enough, I was talking to one researcher who was talking about, said, you also have the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth. I said, what? And I checked with my daughter, who's a psychologist, and she said, yeah, there is that phenomenon, but you get it in societies where there's high social trust and cohesion. So they're a formidable generation, but they're tired, and I think the society is tired. Everywhere you go, posters of the hostages, people wearing everywhere, yellow ribbons, posters saying "Bring them home," pictures of the hostages, absolutely everywhere. Starting with when you land at the airport, but on streets, restaurants, you name it,
and some pretty big demonstrations in behalf of a ceasefire.
Some very big demonstrations. So it's a society that's torn and divided in some ways, and angry and exhausted. And it's also, I think, increasingly feeling beleaguered internationally, appropriately so. I mean, there's been a wave of stuff which is some anti-Israel, some just overtly anti-Semitic. I mean, like in Amsterdam recently, really sort of incitements to riot, and they had an anti-Semitic riot there. Then the sort of the performative stupidity of some European governments. So the British just announced that they're not going to have an Israeli student at the Royal College of Defense Studies, although they kind of boast of all the dictators who graduated from that and then displaced their country's civilian governments, like Pervez Musharraf. And so there's the sense of being beleaguered, and some of his petty things like there were 7 Israeli chess players who were supposed to participate in a chess tournament in Spain, and basically the organizers harassed them out of it, just the kind of cowardly, despicable ways. And so there's that. On the other hand, they're a tough bunch.
So it's a a form of collective punishment on behalf of those who claim to be protesting collective punishment.
Yeah. Well, and look, and in the United States, you're doing it too. You have all these true performers in Hollywood saying, that they intend to boycott Israeli actors and film directors and so on. And I think, by the way, what all this is doing is this is feeding a reaction on the right. And it is going to be grist for the mill in Europe, but also in the United States.
Yeah, it just strengthens the galut mentality, that exists in Israel.
And the truth is, I mean, I'm not an Israeli, but I'm Jewish, as are you, and you feel it, and you resent it. And, the Israeli attitude in particular, but I think more broadly, the attitude of Jewish communities outside Israel is, well, screw you. We're going to continue. This is not the first time that we've been through something like this.
The performative aspect seems incredibly ill-suited to actually accomplish the ends to which it is supposedly being put, which is to try and somehow protect, Palestinians and the idea of a Palestinian state arising out of the occupied territories. So I couldn't agree more.
It is completely detached from that, and it's also completely detached from the reality of Gaza. Now, apparently, the last bit of news here was that Chief of Staff of the IDF said, "You haven't told me what the plans are supposed to be for once we conquer Gaza." And I think there may be some Israelis thinking it through, but it's not clear. You're not, I mean, Gaza is thoroughly wrecked the way like Mosul was after we and the British worked it over in support of Iraq, the Iraqi scheme of maneuver. You're going to need some sort of solution. I also have to say that, I've come to the conclusion that although in some ways a two-state solution would have been the ideal thing, I just don't see how you get there anymore because, you have basically two alternatives. You have Hamas, which is evil, which the Israelis simply cannot tolerate. And even most European governments realize that the Hamas is, you can't tolerate them. And the Palestinian Authority, which is overwhelmingly corrupt, which has had the opportunity to engage in genuine state-building activities, but really hasn't. You and I think both, I didn't really know him. You may have known him better. The one Palestinian leader who really got serious about state building, Salam Fayyad, who did things like, make sure that you had direct deposit into the bank accounts of Palestinian police officers so that their bosses wouldn't skim off the top. And of course, he had to leave the country after his term was
dismissed. Yeah, right. Of course.
He was dismissed. So I don't know what the solution is.
I mean, look, I don't either. I think it's notable that, people like Rob Malley and Hussein Agha, apparently, I've not read their new book, but I have read some reviews of it, apparently have concluded that the, two-state solution is dead as well, even though they have been big proponents of it. I think where we may end up is sort of back to something that, I was involved in early in my career, which was when I was George Shultz's special assistant in the Reagan administration. And we had the Reagan plan, which was for the West Bank to become confederated with Jordan. as part of. I mean, I think that's where this is headed in reality at some point, because I think it's really the only realistic option that sort of is really out there, at least in the near term. Maybe longer term, there's another possibility, but for the moment, I think that's where it's headed.
I agree with that. This last thought I'll just offer on Israel is that despite everything, the cafes are full. There are questions about the economy, but on the whole, the Israeli economy has performed amazingly well throughout all this. There's building everywhere. There's the modern infrastructure is very striking. People are having babies, which is in some ways the best indicator of optimism. And now, and the largest families are the ultra-Orthodox, but even secular Israeli families are way above the replacement rate, and certainly way above European and Asian levels of birth, which tells you
or
something. U.S. I mean, when you walk the streets, you see lots and lots of people pushing baby carriages. I mean, there's something sometimes a little bit weird about it. Like this morning, I was walking over to Shalem College, and there's a guy pushing his toddler, I don't know, to daycare or something like that. And of course, he's carrying an M16 or this was probably an M4 carbine, and he's very cheerful, and the baby's very cheerful. It's all perfectly normal.
So I want to turn to another story that is of interest, I think, to both of us, which is a series of leaks that have come out about the national defense strategy that the Pentagon had promised to deliver really by September. It's clearly going to take a little longer, but a series of leaks in the press, particularly one in Politico, which seem to indicate that the direction of the strategy is not headed in the one that I think a lot of people assumed it would go, which would be a strategy that, in the words of the current Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby, ruthlessly prioritized the Indo-Pacific, and based on his book. Instead, it appears that it is going to, at the instance of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who, according to Politico, has overruled Colby, going to put a focus on the defense of the homeland and the Western Hemisphere. Now, at one level, this is apple pie and motherhood, right? Every national defense strategy since 9/11 has said protecting the homeland is our number one priority. But this seems a little different in the sense that it is based on supposedly a defense of the hemisphere in a way that harkens back to a previous sort of conception of defense strategy, which was sometimes called continentalism, sometimes called hemispheric defense, sometimes caricatured as Fortress America, which was the Renient strategy conception before World War II, and carries us back really to 1940-41. I don't know whether that's where this is actually going to come out. I mean, you can certainly see indications of it in what's going on, which is concentration of lots of military force in the hemisphere, particularly around Venezuela. The strike on the quote narco trafficking drug boat, or maybe migrant boat, we don't know, because the administration has refused to actually provide any serious data on what they did with the strike. And you see it also in the repurposing of the National Guard for domestic defense. So I think if this happens, if that's the way this comes out, this is going to really prompt a very serious national debate about the direction of national security policy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add to that Golden Dome. So Trump's interest in a very elaborate defensive system. I think it actually does fit with the interest in Greenland. which that was in many ways part of the hemispheric defense concept. I think it also the interest in building up or renewing nuclear forces, which both of us are very much in favor of. Those are all part of it, and you're right. It was a coherent conception. Actually George C. Marshall's leading military advisor during World War II was a man named Stanley Embick. He was a lieutenant general. He was regarded as the big brain of the United States Army. Nobody's ever heard of him since, but
except you and me.
Yeah, well, right. Another little piece of useless esoteric knowledge that we kind of lovingly gaze at. But he actually did think very seriously about hemispheric defense. He was willing to give up on the Philippines, by the way, which did not make him popular in the Navy. So it is an old idea. And I think, if there's one thing that I think has struck me in a way about the era that we're living through is that although there is stuff here that is clearly revolutionary in some way, there's also a lot of stuff which is deep continuity with elements of the American past. And, in the same way as the sort of basic isolationism that was in the middle of the Republican Party that Eisenhower beat when he beat Robert Taft for the presidential nomination, it's still there. And I think that post-war internationalism is under threat. I mean, one thing I just noticed is Mike McCall, congressman from Texas, who a classic Republican internationalist, is retiring, and I wonder if you're going to have more of those. On the other hand, the other side of it, though, I think what I would say is that's all very well, but the problem is reality intervenes. And reality, you may want to do things that way. You may want to shut off the rest of the world, but even the United States, with the degree of autarky that it does have, is not really going to be able to do that, I don't think. Now, the problem is you can end up finding that out the hard way, and only kind of coming to your senses after dreadful things have happened. That unfortunately, I think is quite possible. Could I ask you, and we'll see how the NDS thing plays out. We don't know. My guess is I'm not sure Hegseth has any ideas other than lethality and pull-ups, maybe push-ups too. I think, Bridge Colby has this very simple-minded idea: China equals Indo-Pacific, nothing else matters. Somebody who I don't think is simple-minded, and I think does have fairly traditional views, is Marco Rubio. And it'll be interesting to see what his, to the extent that he has a thumbprint that he can put on it. And then, the other uncertainty here is J.D. Vance, who most people associate with the isolationist wing of the administration, which I think is probably right, but he's such a shapeshifter that I'm not sure, I would be convinced that he would be stable in any of his positions. Or maybe you take the view that he really is a hardline isolationist, and that's just what you have to assume.
Well, let me just say a couple of things. One, I think since you raised Stanley Embick, the thing that's very notable about Embick is you're right. Before the war, he was the leading kind of military theorist of continental defense. By the end of the Second World War, he had abandoned that and was one of the architects of the notion of forward defense and power projection by the United States in order to maintain stable balances of power in Europe and in the Far East. So that's, point one. Point two, I'm not sure I completely agree with you about Secretary and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, because he actually, in his time in the Foreign Relations Committee, devoted a lot of it to, in fact, chaired the Committee on the Hemisphere. And because he speaks Spanish, because he is a son of Cuban immigrants to the United States, his first trip as Secretary of State was in the hemisphere. I think a hemispheric defense is actually not necessarily completely alien to his view, particularly since he's adopted many of these America First positions, including on Ukraine, that he didn't hold a couple of years ago. So his shape shifting, I would argue, is that it is, at least parallel to Vice President Vance's. And with regard to Vice President Vance, I would just say he represented the United States. He represented Ohio in the United States Senate. And, to your point about Eisenhower defeating Robert Taft, and I'm not sure if Vance actually holds Taft's seat or whether he holds John Bricker's seat, who carried forward that Taftite tradition into the 1950s under Eisenhower. It's still very powerful in the upper Midwest where Vance hails from, and I expect that he's actually pretty comfortable with that version of the NDS. I could be wrong, but
yeah, I think he may be. I'll attempt a very tepid defense of Rubio in that. Given what his background is, given he does speak Spanish, and given that the hemisphere does matter to us a lot, and something I vividly remember from my time in government, we do tend to neglect Latin America, and I think he was, he has rectified some of that. I think his interest in liberal democracy, at least, was sincere at the time, and I think that does translate into a somewhat more internationalist point of view. So it seems to me he is fundamentally different from Vance in that respect. The thing that's interesting is, you and I both know how people answer polling questions often depends on how they've been framed. But if you look at the MAGA, and even at the Republican Party, which at this point has been sort of taken over by MAGA, there are very strong majorities that are in favor of an internationalist posture. Now, when you pin them down on particular things like, should we be sending aid to Ukraine? Less so, but there is still something of an internationalist consensus. Will that last forever? I don't know. And Matthew Continetti, I think, has been writing about this and making the case that you have that. The more dramatic changes in some ways are in the Democratic Party, where you have where the left wing of the Democratic Party is really pretty crazy, and is, I think, in some ways not internationalist at all anymore.
Well, on that point, again, there's a parallel to, the 1940s, 1950s. Eisenhower defeated Robert Taft and forced that isolationist view kind of underground in the Republican Party for the next 70 years. 4 years earlier, Truman had done the very same from the left-wing challenge, which came from Henry Wallace. And that Wallaceite strain, as you say, is very, very visible in today's Democratic Party, alas.
Yeah. Of course, the other thing is, and this is one of the things I think we've discussed a little bit, but strikes me about the current time is that these currents, which I thought were more or less dead, they just were always there and, underneath the surface. And if you think about it, periodically they would erupt with somebody like Pat Buchanan, who kind of took a similar line. And now they're really out in full force, in part because they have a very permissive government for it.
Or George McGovern, who was actually a delegate at the Progressive Party convention in 1948 that nominated Henry Wallace. Yeah.
Well, there is always this neo-isolationist temptation in the United States, and you can sort of understand why. It's going to be particularly dangerous, I think, in the decades ahead. One thing you touched on, but I know you've got strong views on, and I would like to draw you out on, which is this attack that the U.S. Navy launched on this supposed Venezuelan drug runner. It is amazing to me because this was a law enforcement operation in theory, but they treat it as a military operation in which it's okay to waste guys who are, waste everybody on the ship that is headed in the other direction. And it's an act of war. And nobody seems to be particularly caring about that. Now, if it is filled with Venezuelan drug runners, people are not going to sympathize with them, but that's not really the point. It reminds me, there's a famous Lincoln speech about after a mob in which some riverboat gamblers, I think, are set upon by an angry mob, saying, we don't really care about the riverboat gamblers, but we do care about law and about due process.
There's an arguable case, and some people have argued it. I mean, military lawyers, that these were illegal orders that should have been refused. It's not clear. I don't think they've made it clear yet whether this ship was struck by helicopters dispatched from one of the naval vessels that are out there, or whether it was a drone with some 19-year-old, at the controls, who, assumed that this order, which we know came from the president, because the Secretary of State very carefully said, at the orders of the president, we did this. And since the Secretary of State is not in the chain of command, that very conveniently distances him from what is potentially an illegal order. No, it's the disregard and the potential that this could start to appear in the United States. I mean, let's say one of these. This quote unquote drug vessel, and again, there's been no evidence provided that it was that, as opposed to maybe carrying migrants. Let's say this vessel wasn't 800 miles from the U.S. shores, but going up the Mississippi. And this is in the continental United States. I mean, there's a very slippery, dangerous slope here, involving the military in these kinds of operations. And I worry about it a lot, particularly in a context where posse comitatus doesn't seem to matter. We're getting guardsmen ready to go into Louisiana. We've got them deployed in the District of Columbia. Maybe Memphis. There's a kind of habituation of Americans to the military being used for law enforcement that I think is extremely unhealthy for a democracy.
And won't be acceptable forever. We're coming to the end of our time, so I feel I just have to ask you, so what keeps you cheerful, or at least balanced, in a pretty dismal time?
That's very hard to say. I mean, I would feel better if more Americans were exercised by some of these issues, as you and I are, and as our colleagues at the Bulwark are. The fact that people are, to borrow a phrase from Neil Postman, amusing themselves to death while liberal democracy is under threat is a constant source of concern to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Well,
on that typically cheery note,
we'll still soldier on, won't we?
Yeah. We'll see you next week.